Shabbat Shalom, everyone. You may be seated. This Shabbat, I want to speak to all of you about two articles that were written in the mainstream media this past week. One that I imagine most of you have become familiar with if you haven't even read it. And the other one that might have been missed but is worthy of noting, and I believe worthy of concern. The first one was a modern-day hit job, a 21st century blood libel, written by Nicholas Kristof in the paper of record, the New York Times. And in it, he purports, in the opinion section, about all types of horrific atrocities that have befallen the Palestinians and the Gazans that have been perpetrated by the Israeli Defense Forces and the government of Israel, including some crazy and outlandish claims, which even says that dogs were trained to sexually assault Palestinian prisoners. Sometimes these claims are so hurtful and so painful and so outlandish that you don't even know how to respond, and you don't even know if it's worthy of a response. What I think Kristof's article is trying to do more than anything else is he is trying to draw a moral equivalency, and it's not new. You see, the day that this opinion piece was written, the New York Times sat on an article that was verified, that was bona fide, that had the temerity and the facts behind it, but didn't print till the next day. And of course, not in the opinion section that so many people instantly turn to. It was a report that was over 300 pages with 10,000 pictures and countless testimonies verified from right and left-wing and independent sources of the horrific physical and sexual atrocities that were perpetrated by the Gazans, the Palestinians on October the 7th, and during the captivity of over 250 Israelis that were taken from their homes, their sovereign homes, on that day and held in tunnels and in citizens' basements for too long. This idea by Kristof to put this article out, this opinion piece, one day before, was meant to negate or to nullify the claims that would otherwise rise to the surface 24 hours later. He didn't do it with facts, he did it with opinion, and that wasn't by accident. And this is nothing more than a modern-day blood libel against the Jews. This is nothing more than an article written, though, in the New York Times that is tantamount to saying, we were sucking the blood out of Christians to make matzah again. Just like they did in 1946 in Kielce, Poland, July the 4th, when a young boy was missing from his home for 3 hours, and a whole group of people went out in Kielce with pitchforks and started to kill the Jews, claiming he was in the attic of a Jewish home because they were using his blood to make matzah. I don't know about you, but we don't eat matzah in July. This is no different, except the weaponry is so much more intense by using the New York Times. This isn't some follower putting it on Facebook. This isn't an influencer. This is a reputable paper with what was thought to believe a somewhat reputable opinion writer. And I believe this is done to make that moral equivalency happen, to nullify these actions that would then be printed a day later against the Palestinians, as if to say, yes, what the Palestinians did was wrong, it was terrible, we know that happened, but don't think it was only them, it's really equal, so we can't hold them in contempt. This is not the first time that moral equivalency has been brought into the equation to nullify the claims of others. Today, at Eurovision, as Israel is competing in the semifinals, you will hear chants from the crowds that will loudly say, "Stop the genocide." It's not an accident. That phrase was not arrived at just by happenstance. They chose that word advisedly, because if we claim that Israel is committing a genocide, what we do at that point is we nullify the victimhood of the Jewish people of the state of Israel that was born 3 short years after the worst genocide known in modern history. And by modern, I mean 3,000 years. A systematic killing of 6 million Jews, 1/3 of the Jewish population, most of the population of Jews in Europe, which is where our concentration was. That was a genocide. So by claiming that Israel is committing a genocide, we nullify that sense of our victimhood in the Holocaust. It's very interesting that the Palestinians in Gaza are suffering through a genocide, while all population services say that since October 7th, the population of Gaza has grown. Even with the war against Israel and the eradication and elimination of so many of the terrorists and guerrilla fighters, the population in Gaza has grown. But there's a genocide happening. That word is not an accident. Here's another moral equivalency. Where do the Palestinians live? What is it called, whether it's in Gaza or the West Bank? They live in refugee camps. Now, anyone who has studied history or civics knows that refugee is a status that is given to a person who is forced from their homeland to leave. And even if we were to agree that the Palestinians were indeed refugees, we're talking about 4th, 5th, and 6th generation of people still falling on that claim. That is not how refugee status happens. Almost everyone in this room is probably a 2nd or 3rd generation American, meaning your grandparents or great-grandparents were most likely born in Europe, came over from Russia or Latvia, maybe a few from North Africa or Spain. And whether it was the 2nd generation or your 4th generation, you would never be categorized as refugee. But they are. And refugees, of course, live in refugee camps. And the reason why that word refugee camps is used is to nullify the whole notion of what a concentration camp was. We have now created another equivalency, another behavior that says the way that the Jews are treating the Palestinians is exactly like what happened during the Shoah and the Holocaust. If you remember, about 18 months ago, claims from the right and the left and all different sides of mass starvation happening in Gaza. And they took an emaciated boy and put him on the cover of the New York Times, the same paper of record. And later we found out, with just a little bit of research, that this young boy was suffering from spina bifida. And that's what caused his physical deformation, not malnourishment. But when we say that there's mass starvation happening, and meanwhile it's the only time in all of history that those engaged in a war were responsible for taking their enemy and feeding them too. The only time in history. Find me one other case where that happened. Do you think the Russians are sending cans of tuna fish right now to Ukraine? I don't. Do you think that America was bringing canned beans to Fallujah? We weren't. But the claims of mass starvation are meant to nullify the imagery we have in our head at Bergen-Belsen. When the troops came in to liberate them and we saw walking skeletons, we saw bones that were protruding out through skin of people barely alive. And by claiming mass starvation, we nullify that claim and make some sort of moral equivalency. Sometimes when we make up these lies and we say them enough times, it's as if it's true. It doesn't matter if they have no temerity. It doesn't matter if there are no facts. It doesn't matter if there's nothing to stand behind it. If we just say it enough, then two things happen. One, we get engaged in the whack-a-mole fight of pushing off each of these different claims and saying it's not true. And the second thing that happens in that process of us continuously being in that defense is we get exhausted. I'm exhausted. I bet you're exhausted too from all of this. When Nicholas Kristof wrote this article, the one organization that he turned to was a group from Sweden, an NGO, that is in cahoots and in bed with Hamas. This is where he is getting his facts from. And if he would have done an iota of research, which I am sure he did, but conveniently left out, it would include the fact that this same NGO in 2009 made the preposterous claim that was printed in one of the newspapers in Sweden, that Israel was harvesting organs from Palestinians, both live and dead, and selling them to the highest bidder. Another form of a horrific blood libel. Nothing that had any proof, nothing that had any temerity, something that was just meant to hurl an accusation against the state of Israel without any truth whatsoever. And of course, this was debunked. At the time, Benjamin Netanyahu wanted to bring charges against that Swedish newspaper and against that NGO for that outlandish campaign. But it didn't matter. You see, if they say it, all of us got busy saying, no, it's not true, and where are your facts, and I didn't see it. And they say, but it is true, with no facts to show it. And we begin this whack-a-mole game and this exhausting fight where we're made out to be the state of pariahs, and the Palestinians are the victims. At best, and at worst, those who perpetrated the most heinous acts in modern history against innocent civilians on October 7th, they are equated to what the Israelis are doing now in response, which is absurd. Do you all remember that New York Times article from a couple years ago about how Israel bombed a hospital in Gaza at the onset of the war, and it killed 500 innocent people, many of them waiting to get medical treatment? And Israel immediately denied the report, said, we do not target hospitals, and we will find out where this missile came from. And then, after about 3 weeks of research, and it shouldn't have taken that long, it was concluded by likes of CNN, Al Jazeera, and independent research finders that the bombing of the hospital actually came from an errant missile sent out by Gaza, aimed at innocent civilians in Israel. But it lost its propulsion and fell on the hospital. No one talked about the purpose of that missile and what it aimed to do. And then it was claimed that about 40 people died from this missile, most of them innocent civilians waiting at the hospital for treatment. 40 is too high a number. I don't mean to be flippant about the number 40 and those that were killed by this errant missile by Hamas. But two things have to be brought up. 40 is not 500. If I ask for $500 and someone gives me 40, I would be pretty disappointed. That's a radical difference. And the second difference is, who was responsible for this missile? Was it the big bad Israelis, or was it Hamas, the innocent victims? And I assure you, while that article ran on the front page about Israel's missile bombing the Shifa hospital and 500 people dying, the correction and the information that came from the right and the left, from Al Jazeera and CNN, was not on the front page of that New York Times paper. I'm really worried. I'm really worried about these words that are used and these phrases that are incorporated to nullify the reality of who the Israelis are and what they stand for. How many different people today refer to Israel as an apartheid state? And why? Because in the 80s, there was nothing worse than what was happening in South Africa. There was nothing worse than the unfair and illegal imprisonment of Nelson Mandela, a black man who wanted equality for all of the people in South Africa. But in South Africa, if you were black, you had limited to no rights whatsoever. You were governed differently. You were taxed differently. You couldn't go to certain schools, and you couldn't rise in the political ranks. So they called that apartheid. And they fought that apartheid, and they won. And then Nelson Mandela became the premier of South Africa. So what do they call Israel? Another horrific claim, an apartheid state, as if to imply that those who live in Israel, there's absolute and total separation between the Palestinians and the Israelis. As if what happened in South Africa in the 80s is the same as what's happening in Israel in 2026. But factually, it's wrong. One of the members of the Supreme Court of Israel is a Palestinian Muslim. One of the past Miss Israels is a Palestinian Christian. The Knesset of Israel, comprised of 120 members, has a faction of Palestinians, some Christian, some Muslim, all not Jewish. There is an entire quarter. All of the state of Israel is filled with Palestinians and non-Jews, up to 2 million of them. And they are allowed to work. They are allowed, some of them, to defend us in the IDF. They are allowed to marry whoever they want. There's no separation that happens to them. If there were, they wouldn't rise to the ranks of being leaders in court systems and in government. My son Elias came home from Israel yesterday. He came home on Passover also, but it was in the middle of the Iranian war. And in order to get him home, when the airport in Tel Aviv was closed, we had to get him out either through Jordan and Nakba or Egypt and the Sinai and through Cairo. What he was told is that regardless of whether he goes through Egypt or whether he goes through Jordan, he can bring materials with him to cross the border and to fly out from there, but the one material he could not bring with him was his tallis and tefillin. It was made abundantly clear that if he just crosses the border with the tallis and tefillin, it would be confiscated from him. And since it's something that we bought at his bar mitzvah, and we had him write part of the tefillin and put in, it was very special to us as a family, I said to him, leave your tefillin in your dorm room in Tel Aviv. You'll come back and get it. It's not worth it. And that very same time he crossed, another man who had no connective tissue to Elias but was Jewish, who was also crossing for Passover. You see, he decided to go to Egypt and to start davening in the airport. He snuck his tefillin over, and he got arrested. So I ask you all a question. If you can't pray in Egypt or in Jordan, but we have prayer rooms dedicated for those who want to pray to Islam, and those who want to pray in the Jewish faith, and those who want to pray in Christianity at Ben Gurion Airport, which one's the real apartheid state? But if we make the accusation in one direction, we're so busy denying it that it doesn't give a moment to give oxygen to the truth. And that's exactly what Kristof's article did. It was meant to nullify what was going to come out 24 hours later, to make a moral equivalency between the two, and to take out the idea of facts, honesty, and truth, and to put in junk, crap, unverified resources, and NGOs that have a proven history over the last 2 decades of vilifying Jews and Israel. It is a modern-day blood libel with a huge piece of weaponry known as the New York Times. To quote Matti Friedman, it has become commonplace now, where the journalists of the world are no longer fair arbiters in the fight of Israel and its enemies. They are advocates of the enemy. And it has made our job exponentially harder. And it's all about creating that false moral equivalence. Speaking of moral equivalence, I want to talk to you about the second article that I read this past week. It was written in the newspaper that I quoted last Shabbat here from the Bima, a well-known and well-distributed Jewish newspaper called The Foreword. In the foreword, one of the opinion pieces written by an author named as Hadar Susskind, a Jewish man, claimed that the Nakba should become part of the language, behavior, and commemoration of every Jewish household in the diaspora. Now, I bring this up today not only because the article was written this week, but because of the date of the Nakba and what the Nakba is. The word Nakba is Arabic, and it means the great catastrophe. And it is a word that came to be known as the date that Israel declared its independence, May 14th, 1948. They commemorated on May 15th, 1948. That's the day that the British mandate expired. And they refer to that day as the Great Catastrophe, the day of the Great Catastrophe, the day that Israel became known as a state. Now, for any of you who are alive or any of you who have ever read a book on history of Israel, you'll remember that when Israel declared its independence by David Ben-Gurion on a Friday afternoon in Tel Aviv, that it was just a matter of mere minutes before 6 neighboring countries invaded and attacked Israel for wanting to be an independent Jewish state. Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Iraq all said, not on our watch. And this small fledgling nation that was made up of some Sephardic Jews and a few Jews that survived the atrocities of the Holocaust, they fought for everything they had to establish the state, and they fought for 15 months, and miraculously they won. They won, but they lost 1% of their population at the time. And that's what the Arabs call the Nakba, the great catastrophe. And the Nakba means so much in the radical Islamist world that the elite fighters, what we would call the Green Berets, or what we would call the Delta Force, the elite fighters in Hamas are called the Nakba fighters, the Nakba fighters, meaning we will elevate them to the highest level. And what Hadar Susskind was writing in the Jewish newspaper of The Foreword was that we Jews should all be pausing on May 14th and May 15th to commemorate the atrocities that have happened to the Palestinian people from the day of Israel's declaration and beyond. Now, to his defense, he doesn't say that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, and he doesn't say that we shouldn't commemorate the successes and triumphs of the state of Israel, but that we need to incorporate into our language, our lexicon, our vocabulary, our behaviors, we need to incorporate the Nakba. So now I have an interesting question for Hadar Susskind and for all of those that celebrate his belief. Where's the equivalence here? Can any person in this room or outside find me one serious media outlet, whether it's television or preferably print, in the Islamic world, radical or mainstream or liberal, that says that every Muslim person should be watching Schindler's List, that says that every Muslim should be reading Night by Elie Wiesel, that says that every Muslim should be taking a pilgrimage to Birkenau? Where's the equivalence here? You want to equate what the Jews have done by calling concentration camps and refugee camps the same thing? You want to create starvation equivalents by what happened in Bergen-Belsen to what happened in Gaza? You want to create the notion of an equal genocide between Jews and what happened to them in Europe and what's happening in Gaza today, even though there's no facts to it whatsoever? But you want to take the Nakba and make it a day Jews commemorate, but don't require anything of the same for the counterparts on the other side. Where's the equivalency here? Where's the equality here? Where's the moment of a shared sense of victimhood, if that's what Kristof and others are out for? It is ridiculous and it is crazy. In the world of the CIA, Hadar Susskind would be called a UI. A UI in the CIA means you are a useful idiot. You are someone who is an accomplice who helps them towards their goal, and you're just naive. You're just a fool as to how much you're helping them. And Hadar Suskin's article, in my estimation, makes him a UI for the Palestinian cause and is just as helpful in the libel that Kristof is looking to wage against the state of Israel that Hadar Suskin does, and making this claim that all of us should incorporate the Nakba. And all of you might say, wow, this Kirshner guy, he is devoid of empathy. He has no compassion whatsoever. And I say, baloney. I have plenty of compassion in my heart. I have compassion for Palestinians, especially young Palestinians, who were born into a crappy inheritance by no choice of their own, but by the choices of their ancestors. And I feel sorry for them. But I want to tell you all something. Inheritance is not a destiny. Inheritance is a foundation of which we get that we choose which direction we grow in our adulthood. We can either inherit the victimhood and remain victims and do nothing about it, or we can inherit a sense of victimhood and grow from it. We have that choice. All of us have that choice. And the people who live in Gaza City, the people who live in Tehran, the people who live in Jerusalem, and the people who live in Closter, New Jersey, all inherit from their ancestors, and they all have the same choice of what they will do with that emotional inheritance. It's not another's fault because of that inheritance. When 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds choose to blow themselves up or to make up preposterous claims because of the choices of their ancestors, it is weak, it is wimpy, it is shameful, and it is not the fault of their ancestors. We cannot blame our successes and failures today on Hitler. We can blame our successes and failures from 38 to 45 on Hitler, and even from 45 to 50, I would say, but not today. We might have inherited the actions of the Nazis and what they did to the Jewish people, but what we do as a response to it, that is on us. What Nicholas Kristof did in that horrific article in the New York Times, it's tantamount to The Hague deciding that they would posthumously put Mordechai Anilevich, the hero of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, on trial in 1946 for killing German officers and soldiers in the uprising in Warsaw, just days before Gideon Hausner would offer the opening statement in the trial against Eichmann. That is what it is tantamount to. It is a ridiculous libel. And it is so far-fetched to think that we could put Anilevich on trial in The Hague for killing German officers and soldiers and defending his whereabouts. But that's what Kristof did. And he did it literally, in the analogy, minutes before Eichmann was to stand trial. There is no equivalence between Anilevich and Eichmann. And there is no equivalence between Yahya Sinwar of Hamas and Bibi Netanyahu of Israel. There is no equivalence between the Nakba fighters that took and captured and raped and pillaged homes and innocents from their beds on October 7th and the Israeli Defense Forces that went to repatriate those people taken. And there is no equivalence between the 251 hostages who were taken from sovereign Israel, who were held against their will, not spoken to any of their families, not seen by the Red Cross, not talked to doctors, held in tunnels in the dark for some of them 2+ years. And the prison systems that the Israelis keep those Gazan terrorists in, where they get medical attention, where they get 3 halal meals a day, where they can see their family, where they get legal representation, and where they're afforded the opportunity to pray 5 times as devout Muslims. They are not equivalent. And our responsibility in the wake of these articles is to call out the crap, to call out these preposterous claims. And I get it. Trust me, I feel like you do. I am exhausted from playing whack-a-mole. And I am tired from continuing to fight for my right and your right to exist. But that's what they're banking on. They're banking on defeating us through exhaustion, and they're banking on lies and falsehoods in the face of truth. This is a moment for us to gird up. This is a moment for us to call out this non-moral equivalency. This is a moment on us to call on the Suskins of the world and say, when you write an article telling every Muslim to watch Schindler's List and read Night and go to Birkenau, maybe I'll talk about the Nakba. But I'm not going to join you in the pursuit of being a useful idiot. And I'm not going to sit idly by while Nicholas Kristof writes in the paper of record a blood libel against the Jews, and we just say, when we just say, okay, there were really bad things happening on both sides, because it's not the truth. And if there's anything that book teaches us, it's to follow the truth. Shabbat shalom, everybody.